All right, let's talk about white privilege. Yay! Are you a white person who gets annoyed at your white friends telling you about white privilege and posting articles and things that seem to want to teach you about your white privilege? Or are you someone who shares those articles and get frustrated with your white friends because they just don't seem to get it? Well, that's what I want to talk about today. I don't claim to be an expert at white privilege. My focus really is on how to talk about things, how to interpret and understand what people are saying. That's what I hope to bring to this conversation. Now, the concept of white privilege, I guess, has been around for a long time. It was popularized in the late 80s by a woman named Peggy McIntosh. She is an academic women's studies or something, but she did a paper about white privilege, male privilege. First thing I want to talk about is why I think she did this paper, what she hoped to accomplish with it, and why I think the rest of us are still talking about this. People are still talking about white privilege. What's the goal? What's the purpose of enlightening you on your white privilege? If you assume that there's racism in the United States, whether you agree with that or not, or question it to some degree, just for sake of logic and for sake of understanding the concept, make that assumption. Historically, white people would sort of individualize it. They would say, okay, well, to the extent that racism exists, it's not my problem because I'm not racist. I treat everybody the same. I like everybody the same. I am not racist, so not my problem. The purpose behind talking about white privilege all the time now, and the purpose behind the paper, was to make the point that it's a problem we all share. You could make an appeal to us as Americans, which is the way I prefer to look at it, us as humans. We should care about one another. That's my approach. But what white privilege is kind of trying to say that whether you are racist or not, when black people experience racism in the United States, wherever and however they experience it, you're not. So that puts you at an advantage. That means you have privilege, whether that's feeling comfortable going outside their city into the more rural areas, being treated fairly, looked upon as with suspicion, feeling comfortable and safe, freedom of movement, that sort of thing. If their racism exists, then black people and other minorities don't feel the same safety, freedom, as general Americans. So the point of the thing is, you as a white person, because you have those things, that's a privilege. That's an advantage that you have. So some would even say that means you're complicit in racism, therefore you have a duty to try to do something about it. That's the concept in a nutshell. Now, why is it difficult to talk about? The term white privilege is fine as an academic principle, because when you're looking at things academically, you read, you study, you try to understand what it means, you try to learn it. But if you're using that label to try to influence and persuade people to your way of thinking or to change the way they're thinking, it's really not a good persuasive label or branding, if you want to call it that. Why is that? Well, because privilege is a relative thing. If you tell any person you are privileged, your average white person does not feel privileged. There are so many other people that to them seem to have a much easier way in life, that seem to have financial advantages, social advantage, educational advantages. The lower you go in the income level or the socioeconomic ladder, if you will, the harder it is to convince a white person that they are privileged, because they can point to so many other people, black and white, that have much more privilege than them. So when you tell a person you're privileged, to a lot of people, that's like taking a drink of sour milk. They just instinctively spit that right out. They instinctively reject that. The term itself creates a barrier to communication and a barrier to learning. Again, as an academic principle, fine. But if someone had ever sat down and said, okay, how do we now make this part of the national social conversation? you would have picked a much better term than that. But of course, that never really happened. It's just people sharing memes and articles, and everybody's using the term. So if you really want someone to be receptive of what you say, privilege isn't a great word to be telling. It's not great to tell them that they are privileged. As much as that may be accurate when you completely understand the term, it's still a problem. It's still a problem for communication. It's still a barrier to learning. It divides people. I personally think privilege is a bad term because, to me, privilege is something extra. If a person owns a company and they employ 100 people, they may opt to have their own private bathroom. That's a privilege that they have being the owner of that company. It's their choice. They can choose that. Now, if the 100 employees get together and complain, or the owner of the company decides that it's a morale problem and he chooses no longer to have that privilege, he's not going to give every 100 employees their own bathrooms. He's not going to build 100 bathrooms. He's going to take away his own. Privileges, if they become a problem, are taken away. There's something extra. Technically, dictionary definitions, it works for the white privilege intended meaning. I'm just talking about how people communicate and how they see words. So when you say to someone, you have privilege, it's something extra. Now, surely you could say you have extra being a white person if black people are suffering these injustices and disadvantages. But injustice is not the norm. You don't address privilege by taking it away and forcing injustice on everyone else. The goal should be to lift everyone up. The problem of white privilege should be addressed by ensuring that everyone gets access to those. And they're not privileges. I mean, just the freedom of movement, not to worry about how people might perceive you on a regular basis wherever you travel to, whatever you try to do. To always be wondering if people are going to prejudge you based on the way you look, the color of your skin, something you can't even change. That's not a privilege. I mean, that's the bar, if you will. That's sort of the minimum to being an American, if you ask me. Which takes me to the way I look at this. I'm not sure that intimidation, arguing, yelling, putting people down is the best way to address racism. Now, I get it. If somebody's a committed white supremacist, Nazi kind of a thing, sure, you want to attack that. But I feel like we really lowered the bar on who qualifies to be called a Nazi and a white supremacist. I mean, clearly we have. It's like, if you don't agree with me, if you don't believe that there is white privilege, then you're a racist or you're a Nazi. To me, the way to help address racism is to bring people together. Certainly the people more inclined to just accept a term like white privilege uncritically, without really thinking about it, are more liberal, kind of left-leaning people. So more conservative, right-leaning people are more likely to question it, to say, well, no, I don't agree with that. Those are the same people that tend to have this pro-America, love being America, America is great kind of pride. The way I look at it is we're all Americans. I mean, regardless of your background, your nationality, your skin color, your gender, any of that, when you're born here, especially if your families and things have been here, that's your birthright. Your birthright is to be an American and to be an equal American. And that's what I love about America, is the equal treatment, the equal opportunity. So when I find out that that doesn't exist, that that's not the experience of everyone, then that hurts me. And I want to do something about that, because that's how I see us. I see us as humans, and I see us all as Americans. When we get divided and we start using condescending things, or what's received as condescending, like white privilege, I see that as counterproductive. If that works for you, if that works for certain people, then fine, use that, okay? But if you think about this, someone going out and proclaiming their white privilege, it kind of can be a way to hide the fact that they're racist too, right? I mean, we all have biases. We all have things that affect us. So someone who actually is dealing with a certain amount of racism that they'd like to see changed, they can really hide from that. They can virtue signal and say, well, I have white privilege, so I'm a poor, it's not my choice. I'm a victim. It's just a part of the system. So it depersonalizes it for someone like that. So it's really not the be-all, end-all best answer. If anything, we should want to have a conversation. What I would recommend everyone do, if you question the existence of racism, how extreme it is, what I would suggest is what you need to do is listen to people tell their stories. Don't listen to politicians or activists, people yelling at you, calling you bad. You must do this. You must believe that. You must accept that. Look for the people that are just telling you their lived experience in the United States of America as full birthright Americans. Listen to those stories. Now, not every person is going to have a story like that. There are some black people who say, well, I think it's exaggerated too. But you can't just pick the people that confirm your biases. You don't want to just say, well, I got one friend who says this, so that applies to everyone. No, listen to people share their experiences and stories, and you'll hear something. There are newspaper articles. I'll see if I can find one and put it in the description for this, where people talk about what it was like in the town they grew up in, as a minority. And just think about that this person was born an American, and just listen to their story of what it was like. If you belong to a church, hopefully your church engages these types of discussions. Anytime this has been addressed at my church, they've allowed people to talk about it, just to tell their stories, not to point fingers, not to accuse, just to say, this is it. This is my story. You may have some associates, coworkers, friends, that are black, but the more they're in the minority, so if you work at a company that has 20 white people and 1 or 2 black people, don't just assume that they're freely telling you how they feel and what they experience. Because if you reverse those situations, and you're in that much of a minority, you're not necessarily going to be comfortable either. You're not necessarily going to just say how you feel or share your life's experience, because you're not going to feel that that's going to be safe. None of us, there takes a vulnerability to share that sort of thing. And none of us are going to be honest and share our personal feelings and our background in our life if we feel like the people we're talking to are going to challenge that. If we say, this is what happened to me, and this is how I felt about it, and if someone in the audience is saying, oh, that's all totally false, that doesn't prove anything, and I have data, that's really not an environment that's going to encourage people to be open and honest. If you say you love all people, you can't say you love a person if you're not going to listen to them, if you're not going to let them just especially when they're telling their story. You can't tell someone that their lived experience is wrong. That doesn't mean everything that they interpret is 100% correct. It doesn't mean that every incident that they can cite where they were victims of race or judged based on their race, they're not all going to be 100% right. But you just got to look at the totality of it. When something happens on a frequent basis like that, sure, you're going to be, more likely to assume that. If you've already decided that there's no such thing as racism, and if you've already decided you're just going to reject all these things and challenge them until somebody can prove it to you, concrete, 100% fact, nobody's ever going to be able to prove that to you. It's a problem. It's an injustice. I base that statement on people who have told me their stories. Honestly, if you can listen to those stories with an open mind and totally not care, not be moved to some level, I think you will. If you listen to enough of those stories, that you will. If you're already someone who, to view this is all so obvious, you don't see. If some of these things play to your biases, all these accusations of racism, these stories of racism, and terms like white privilege, if that just already plays into your biases, then you're more likely to just receive them uncritically and just repeat them, maybe even in less context than what was given to you. Just because someone that you're talking to doesn't receive those uncritically, they use a little more of a critical questioning eye, doesn't mean they're bad people. Communication is less about what you're saying and more about what they're hearing. If you're trying to communicate a concept, if you're trying to communicate a value or an idea or a feeling or a thought, the important thing in that is that the audience hears you. There aren't always open and willing audiences, but you at least need to try. It's not necessarily about you believing you said the right words, so much as if you care enough to want to convince somebody or persuade somebody, you have to try to put yourself, in other words, you kind of have to consider their story too. You have to consider their perspective and their view. That's what I think about when I see people arguing about white privilege, when I see white people arguing about white privilege. It happens all the time. Regardless of how you feel about everything else that's being said around you, when someone starts to share their story, their lived experience, you really need to listen to that. And you need to listen to that with an open mind and an open heart. Okay, that's Bob on white privilege. If you got anything out of this video, please share it, like, subscribe, and I'll bring you more. Be blessed.